Hello, I'm Sam, and today I'm going to be walking you through my painting of the Hanged Man for the Blood Moon Tarot. The Blood Moon Tarot is a tarot deck that I'm currently working on, and you can find out more about the deck and see more of the finished cards at bloodmoontarot.com. You can also support my project, watch more of my process, and follow updates at my Patreon website, and the links for both of those are up in the corner. The first thing you'll see me doing here is establishing a basic value structure by laying down some really light washes. I keep them pretty monochromatic. It's mostly just to push back the white of the page. You'll see me lifting up the pigment in certain areas, specifically around the Hanged Man's base and parts of the snake and the two foreground branches. And that's because at the end of the painting, those are going to be some of the lightest areas. So I try to preserve the white of the page for as long as possible during this part of the process. While I'm building up these layers, I take it as slow as possible with the darker values. And that's mostly because once you go really dark with watercolors, it's hard to lift it back up. It all depends on the pigment you're using. Some of them are pretty permanent and will stick to the page unless you literally scrape the paper away, and others will lift right up. So in these first stages, I do take it really slow and don't go too dark too fast. You'll notice that I am lifting up some of the paints with the brush, and I just get the brush kind of wet, lay down the water, and then take a drier brush and lift it up. I'll also use a paper towel at times. Sometimes that's easier if you're doing a larger space. I have a value study that I'm referencing, though it's cut out of the frame. The piece of the paper up at the top of the page is a little paper that has a bunch of my reference on it. It has some pictures of moths and snakes and a couple of paintings that I like the palettes of. To the left of my painting, I have a piece of paper with a bunch of watercolor mixes on it, and I used that playing around to figure out what I wanted to use for a palette on this piece. And to the right is my little palette that I use, and I have a small porcelain dish where I'm mixing some of the paints. The palette featured there is kind of my small go-to travel palette. I actually have a butcher's tray now, which is really useful if you're mixing a large amount of one color. That way, if you have a small dish like the porcelain one there, you don't have to keep trying to mix the same color over and over if you run out. You'll probably notice that I have this weird thing going on there with bulldog clips. I was experimenting with a way to stretch the watercolor paper, and I don't know why I thought this would work because, spoiler alert, it didn't. The paper was buckling, and they also got in the way of my hand while I was painting, so I didn't try that again. What I do now is I use brown painter's tape to stretch the page, and I didn't know it at first, but you cannot remove the brown tape from the watercolor paper. You have to cut it off. So I did ruin a painting before I figured that out. So what I do now is I'll use the brown tape on the edges of the paper, giving myself some extra space around the area where I'll be painting. And then I'll use black or white painter's tape around the edge of the painting, so I have a nice clean white edge around it. And it'll give me enough space to have that clean area and still cut off the brown tape from the page. While working on the background in this painting, where all those branches are, I switched back and forth from greener colors to more warm yellowy colors, just because I had a hard time deciding what I wanted to do with that. I ended up not liking the initial wash I did, but it worked out, and all those different layers built up this sort of murky green atmosphere. Once I get the initial washes to a certain stage, I go in for details in the painting, like his scales that he's emerging from and his hair. And I don't complete those areas, but I build up enough value and color there and then go on to a different area and build it up until everything is about an equal level, and then I go in with details after that. The last stages of this painting get cut off just because the files when I was transferring got corrupted, so I don't have them. But I can tell you that I use acrylic wash sometimes in the final stages of the painting, but just for the areas of detail that have the darkest darks and little white highlights. So I use sepia and titanium white for acrylic wash. I'll use the sepia for some of the lines, such as the little details on the scales and the snake skin that the hanged man is shedding. And the white I'll use in something like the snake's eyes, or in the figure's eyes if their eyes are open. If you don't know what acrylic wash is, it's a highly pigmented paint that has some of the properties of both gouache and acrylics. So it's water soluble and it acts a little bit like a highly pigmented gouache, but once it dries, it's water resistant, but it does also dry very matte, kind of like gouache. So it's sometimes fun to use in paintings, but I don't use it all the time. I like my watercolors. You might be curious about the brushes I'm using. I mostly get cheap watercolor brushes because I'm prone to abusing them and scrubbing with them, but I do usually invest in sable brushes for the really tiny ones that need to keep a point. The ones I used in this were the first sable brushes I ever used, and I wore them out probably after 1 or 2 paintings, and it turns out I had bought the wrong brand. Somebody recommended another brand that lasts a little bit longer, so I've been buying that brand now, and I'll give you a little link down in the show notes so you know if you're interested in getting little sable brushes. But I like that they are able to hold a lot of water and pigment, and they're pretty good at keeping a point and also, you know, having a wide range of line weight. So I should also mention that what I'm painting on here is not the original drawing. Part of my process is doing the drawing, scanning it in, and then I print the drawing out on watercolor paper. This is a better thing for me to do than to transfer it by hand, because if I mess up with the watercolor, which happens quite a bit, it's easier for me to print out, you know, a fresh image and start again instead of having to transfer it. And the other thing is I didn't ever have a light box, so I would use the window light to transfer images. It's a great way to make do if you don't have a light box, but it's also really time consuming and tiring, and it relies a lot on the sun. And I live up north, so we don't always have a ton of sunlit hours, especially during the winter. So this method is really useful for me and it saves me a lot of time, especially if I mess up and I really want to start over. So I'm using genuine Serpentine, which is a watercolor from Daniel Smith. And Daniel Smith makes some watercolors with precious stones and fancy things like that as the pigment. And I like using it on my tarot cards because it adds a little extra something to it. So Serpentine is kind of a neat little stone. It ranges from bright lime green to slightly more muted greens, and it has a really neat scaly quality to it. And the paint itself actually granulates, so you get these weird gold and green marks coming together once the paint dries and settles. So it's a really fun green to use if you're interested in playing with fancy watercolors. So I'm wearing a glove here, and it's not for any paint safety reasons. It's just because I had eczema on my hands at the time, and I put some lotion on my hands, and I didn't want to risk getting it on the paper because the paper will just absorb that and ruin everything. So if you want to keep oils and lotions and stuff off your painting while you're working and you use them on your hands, I suggest using gloves while doing so. I'm going to sit back and let you enjoy the rest of the video, and I'll see you at the end. thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. To see the full final image, go to bloodmoontarot.com. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Just leave them in the comments. Thanks!